Let's get right into it. Why does that exact same smartphone you've been eyeing suddenly cost way more than it did just a month ago? Or how about when a trade dispute halfway across the world instantly jacks up the price of your groceries or a new car? Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to break down a topic that hits literally every single one of us right in the wallet: how tariffs quietly raise prices.
Hey, I'm Coach Kobo, and today we're shining a massive spotlight on the hidden culprit behind those frustrating, rising costs you're seeing everywhere. That culprit? It's the tariff. It's a word politicians throw around constantly, but honestly, its real-world impact is so often completely misunderstood.
Here is the absolutely crucial reality you need to know. You pay more. When countries decide to play hardball with international trade, it's ordinary consumers like us who end up absorbing the shock. It's that visceral pain you feel at the checkout line when you realize your budget just doesn't stretch nearly as far as it used to. But this opens up a huge question, right? If tariffs make things so expensive for everyday folks, why in the world do countries still use them? Well, to figure that out, we've got to start at square one.
Let's peel back the first layer of this onion. A tariff is quite simply a tax placed by a government on imported goods. That's the whole shebang. It just means that when products travel across the ocean on a huge cargo ship and enter a country's ports, the government essentially stands at the border, holds its hand out, and charges an extra fee just to let those goods inside. Think of it like a really expensive entry ticket that costs real money.
Let's actually walk through how this plays out in real life with some simple math. Imagine an American company wants to bring a product into the country to sell. Let's set a baseline cost for this. The manufacturer abroad charges exactly $1,000 for this item. Okay, simple enough. A clean $1,000 is what the American business fully expects to pay to acquire it.
But wait, here comes the government. Let's introduce a tariff rate into our equation. The government decides, hey, we're imposing a 20% tariff on this specific category of imported items. So that is an extra 20% fee charged right on top of the original price, collected by customs long before the item is ever allowed to hit a warehouse shelf or a showroom floor.
And boom, this perfectly illustrates the immediate, jarring mathematical reality. That $1,000 product, the importer just had to fork over an extra $200 in taxes to the government. So the new hard cost of that item for the business is now $1,200. Now you might be thinking, well, tough break for that business. But look, businesses aren't charities, right? They operate on profit margins, and they almost never quietly absorb a massive financial hit like this themselves. No way. Because businesses absolutely refuse to just eat that extra $200 loss and crush their own profits. They do what literally any business would do. They shift the burden directly onto your shoulders. The costs are passed down to you. The old price tag in the store gets ripped off and a higher number gets slapped on. The tariff might technically be levied on the business, but the actual cash paying for it? Yeah, that's coming straight out of your wallet. And this sets off what we call a ripple effect on prices across the entire economy. It doesn't just stop at one little item. We're talking higher phone prices, way more expensive cars, rising appliance costs, and even higher food prices at your local grocery store. And here's a totally fascinating detail. Even products entirely manufactured and assembled right here in America will often rise in price. Why? Because the raw materials, the microchips, or even just the tiny imported screws they rely on suddenly got hit by a tariff. The ripple touches absolutely everything. So, this brings us to the elephant in the room. If tariffs so clearly and directly raise prices for everyday people and just squeeze our household budgets, why on earth do governments continue to use them? Like, what is the big picture political and economic motivation that justifies making life so much more expensive for their own citizens?
Well, there are two primary, heavily debated reasons governments use tariffs, and it's super important we look at both sides impartially. First up is protecting local industries. By making foreign goods artificially more expensive through a tax, a government can make its own locally produced goods look cheaper and a lot more appealing to buyers, which helps domestic factories compete. The second reason? Fighting trade wars. Tariffs are frequently deployed as literal economic weapons during international disputes, especially between massive economies like the US and China, acting as leverage to force changes in trade agreements.
But here is where things get truly complicated. When governments start relying on these international trade war tactics, it almost never goes smoothly. These strategies can quietly and completely unexpectedly damage both sides of the conflict. It is never a one-way street because, let's face it, we don't live in a world where countries operate in isolated little bubbles anymore. Just take a single, everyday smartphone. It isn't just made in one place. It relies on American software, Chinese assembly, Korean memory chips, and Taiwanese processors. It's like a giant puzzle of multi-country supply chain logistics. So when you drop a tariff bomb into the middle of this intricate web, you aren't just hitting one country. You're blowing up a massively complex global ecosystem. And when you disrupt that ecosystem, and global trade suddenly gets much more expensive, the macroeconomic consequences fire off rapidly. Businesses start to panic. They reduce their imports. Factories drastically cut their production quotas. Companies delay their big plans for expansion and totally freeze hiring. Ultimately, all of this culminates in much slower overall economic growth for everyone involved. The friction in the system just becomes way too much to handle.
Which brings us pivoting right back to you, the consumer. Who actually pays for tariffs? There's this super common political narrative out there telling us that tariffs are just a way to punish foreign governments or bad actors overseas. But as we've just mapped out, the reality is a whole lot closer to home. The cost isn't absorbed by a foreign government. It's passed right through the supply chain, onto the business, and ultimately onto that final price tag you scan at the register.
And honestly, this is exactly why tariffs are the subject of such intense, relentless economic debate. On one side of the aisle, proponents argue fiercely that tariffs protect domestic jobs, keeping local factories open and workers employed by fending off really cheap foreign competition. On the flip side, critics argue just as fiercely that tariffs are essentially a hidden tax that artificially spikes consumer inflation, which ends up hurting the poorest households the absolute most. And the truth? Economically speaking, both of those arguments contain a really valid degree of truth. They're just two sides of the exact same coin. So the whole thing basically operates like a slow-motion domino effect. On day one, a government proudly announces a brand new tariff. By month one, shipping and supply chain costs quietly begin to rise for importers. Fast forward to month three, and global markets react to all that friction. Stock volatility hits hard, and factories scramble to adjust. And finally, by month six, those costs slam into the retail shelves, and your daily living costs have noticeably shot up. One signature on day one quietly ripples all the way out to your bank account half a year later.
And that brings us to the core lesson of today's explainer. What sounds like taxing foreign goods almost always ends up changing prices everywhere. We live in a deeply, unavoidably interconnected world economy. You literally cannot drop a rock in one side of the pond without the ripples eventually washing up on the other shore. These invisible global taxes fundamentally alter the math of everything we buy.
So as you go about the rest of your week, I really want you to look closely the next time you're standing in a store, holding a product and frowning because the price seems inexplicably higher than it was last year.
What hidden tax is secretly raising the price of your next purchase? Are you actually paying for the product, or are you just footing the bill for a geopolitical chess match? If you found this explainer helpful in untangling the messy world of global economics, I'd absolutely love for you to join our community. Hit that like button and subscribe to Deez Finance for more simple breakdowns. I'm Coach Kobo, and I'll catch you next time.